The alarm did not sound like the usual ones. Station Ardenmore had alarms for fire, for hull breach, for oxygen failure, for unauthorized docking. The personnel who lived and worked on the station had heard all of them at least once. They knew the sound, they knew the drill, they knew where to go. But the alarm that tore through every speaker on every deck at 07:14 Standard Time that morning was different. It was the Council emergency klaxon. The one reserved for threats so large, so unknown, so outside the normal list of problems, that the station's central intelligence did not even try to name it. It simply screamed. Corridor 7 went quiet in about 4 seconds flat. A Thurani diplomat named Seloreth had been walking to his morning briefing when the sound hit. He was tall, pale-shelled, six-armed, and had lived through 2 border conflicts and a trade war. He pressed himself flat against the wall of Corridor 7 and sent a distress ping to the Thurani embassy on the nearest relay station before he even looked up to see what was coming. What was coming was not what he expected. The thermal sensors had flagged something large, much larger than any registered life form on the station's manifest. The seismic monitors built into the floor plating, designed to detect hull stress or equipment failure, had started logging irregular rhythmic pressure readings. Something heavy, something with a stride, something moving at a steady, unhurried pace down the corridor from the direction of the civilian habitat ring. Security Chief Boren received the alert in his quarters, dressed in about 90 seconds, and arrived at the Corridor 7 junction in full combat armor with 8 officers behind him. Boren was Drenkai, stocky, gray-skinned, with 4 eyes arranged in 2 pairs, and the kind of calm that came not from ease but from years of choosing not to panic. He had 4 officers take the left side, 4 take the right, and he positioned himself in the center of the corridor with one hand near his sidearm and both pairs of eyes wide open. He saw Cadet Rylan Das first. The boy was 19, medium height, brown hair that was slightly too long for regulation. He was wearing his gray cadet uniform, which had a faint dust mark on the left knee from what appeared to be recent contact with a floor. He was walking at a perfectly ordinary pace, one hand loosely wrapped around a thick braided leash, the other hand holding an open tin of something that smelled, even at this distance, strongly of protein paste. He was not running. He was not looking around in alarm. He was walking the way a person walks when they are doing something they have done 100 times before and expect to do 100 times again. The thing on the leash was not ordinary. It was large enough that its shoulder came up to Ryland's chest. It moved on 6 limbs, 4 along the main body like thick, scaled pillars, and 2 smaller ones near the front that it used to balance when it slowed. Its hide was dark gray-green, layered in overlapping armored scales that ran from the broad flat head all the way down a body that was wide and low and long, ending in a heavy barbed tail that swung slowly with each step. Along its spine, a ridge of bony plates rose and fell like the peaks of a small mountain range. Its head was wide and flat, the jaw long, the mouth closed but visibly thick with what anyone with eyes could tell was an architecture built entirely around one purpose. Its eyes were the strangest part, 2 of them set wide on either side of the head, and they glowed, a soft, steady amber like embers that had not quite gone out. The sound it made while it walked was not a growl. It was lower than that. It was a vibration more than a sound, something that the ear barely caught but the chest felt immediately, a deep subsonic pulse that seemed to travel through the floor plating and up through the soles of every boot in the corridor. 2 of Boren's officers took an involuntary step backward. One of them later filed a report claiming equipment malfunction. Nobody argued with the report. Boren held his position. Rylan noticed him about 10 meters out, gave a small nod, and pulled lightly on the leash when the creature's wide head swung toward one of the Velori engineers who had frozen against the wall, their gelatinous bodies cycling rapidly through a cascade of camouflage colors that accomplished nothing because the creature's amber eyes tracked movement, not color. "Hey, Grex, heal," Rylan said, not loudly. The same tone someone uses to correct a dog who has wandered off the pavement. The creature, Grex, pulled its gaze from the Velori engineer and fell back into step beside Ryland's left leg. Boren stared. Ryland stopped in front of him. "Morning, Chief. Sorry if we set something off. He just needs his walk. Vet's orders 30 minutes of movement a day or he gets restless. I usually do the lower ring, but the cargo lifts were backed up." Boren looked at Grex. Grex looked at Boren. The amber eyes did not blink. The subsonic rumble continued at a low, steady frequency. The barbed tail moved once, slow and heavy, like something ticking over in idle. Boren looked back at Rylan. "What?" he said, and then stopped and started again. "What is that?" Rylan looked down at Grex with the expression of someone who has been asked a question they find slightly obvious. "He's an arboreal ridgeback. His name's Grex. I've had him since he was small." He held out the tin. "You want to give him one, he's good. He won't bite unless I tell him to." The 8 officers behind Boren did not visibly react to this. Boren did not take a piece from the tin. He clicked his comm instead and said, in a voice that had gone very flat and very controlled, "Get me a line to the council chamber. All seats. Tell them it is not a drill." Down the corridor, the Thureni diplomat Seloreth was still pressed against the wall. He watched Grex's tail swing past him at roughly eye level. He did not move. He did not breathe. He sent a second distress ping to the relay station and then, because the first 2 had not felt like enough, a third. Grex paused, turned his wide, flat head, and looked at Seloreth with one glowing amber eye from a distance of about 40 centimeters. Seloreth made a sound that had no translation in any registered Union language. Ryland tugged the leash gently. "Come on, leave him alone." Grex turned back and walked on. The council chamber's klaxon was still running. It would continue to run for another 6 minutes before someone remembered to turn it off. By then, every senior delegate on Station Ardenmore had been woken up, dressed, and summoned. 17 species, 49 individual council seats, all of them waiting for the emergency briefing. None of them yet knew that the emergency was a 19-year-old boy and his pet. The Grand Council Chamber of Station Ardenmore had been built to impress. The ceiling rose 40 meters above the floor in a smooth arc of reinforced transparasteel, giving a full view of the gas giant below and the slow drift of its rings. The tiered seating curved in a wide horseshoe around the central floor, each tier assigned to a different species, each seat shaped and sized and lit to suit the biology of whoever sat in it. 17 species, 49 delegates, a room that had hosted peace treaties, border negotiations, trade agreements that changed the lives of billions. A room that had, in its 40 years of use, never once needed to dim its lights for any reason other than a formal closing ceremony. They dimmed them now because Grex's eyes were making the Thureni delegation physically ill. Ryland stood at the center of the chamber floor. Grex sat beside him, which was the only concession Ryland had made to the formality of the setting. He had told Grex to sit, and Grex had sat, folding his 6 limbs beneath his body in a low, wide crouch that still left him taller than the central podium. His armored tail lay flat along the floor. His spinal ridges caught what light remained and threw faint shadows up the curved walls. The amber glow of his eyes was the brightest thing in the room. Council Speaker Mereth sat at the highest tier, directly ahead of Rylan. She was Selori, silver-feathered, with a long, narrow face, eyes that were dark and calm and very old, and the kind of composure that came from 30 years in politics. She had, over the course of those 30 years, negotiated with warlords, mediated species-ending conflicts, and once talked a Gurren fleet commander out of firing on a civilian transport for 6 consecutive hours. She looked at Grex for a long moment, then at Rylan, and then she said, in a voice that filled the chamber without needing to be raised, "Cadet, explain this." Rylan explained it. He did not seem nervous. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides. The leash looped once around his left wrist, and he answered every question in the same steady, slightly puzzled tone of someone who genuinely did not understand what all the fuss was about. Grex was an arboreal ridgeback. He was 6 years old. Ryland's family raised them on the human colony world of Dunmore Station, where the terrain was thick swamp, and the wildlife had certain tendencies that made it useful to have something large and unbothered walking beside you. The breed had been developed over about 40 years from gene stock that included earth alligator, a native Dunmore swamp crawler, and a small contribution of deep ocean predator DNA from Kelly's IV, acquired through a registered union trade agreement and fully documented. He had Grex's papers. He produced them from a flat case under his arm, a transit permit stamped by 3 separate union checkpoints, a vaccination record 14 pages long, a letter from the Dunmore Station Veterinary Authority certifying Grex's behavioral profile as stable, and a handler's license issued to one Ryland Das, valid across union space, renewable every 2 years. He laid everything on the central podium in a neat stack. Marath looked at the stack, then she looked at Grex, then she said quietly to no one in particular, "They have a form for this." The Muvari delegate, Councillor Drethan, had been very still since Ryland entered the chamber. The Muvari were small, not much larger than a human child, with pale skin and wide, light-sensitive eyes, and the particular nervous energy of a species that had spent most of its evolutionary history being something else's food. Drethan had managed, through significant personal effort, to remain in his seat while Grex was escorted in. He had filed a formal complaint with the Union Health Office about the subsonic rumble, which he described in the complaint as an aggressive acoustic weapon deployed without warning in a diplomatic setting. He was still vibrating slightly. He leaned forward and said, with the clipped precision of someone choosing words very carefully, "You are telling this council that you brought a predator, a large, gene-modified, multi-species predator, onto a diplomatic station carrying the representatives of 17 Union species, and your justification is," he paused, "a piece of paper." "Several pieces of paper," Ryland said. Someone in the upper tiers made a sound. It may have been a laugh. It stopped very quickly. Drethan was not finished. "How is this creature controlled? What prevents it from—" He stopped again, visibly wrestling with the next words. "Acting on instinct." Ryland considered the question seriously, which was the right thing to do. "Training, mostly. We started when he was about 8 weeks old. At that age he was small enough that I could carry him, so he got used to being handled early. A lot of it is repetition. A lot of it is trust." He paused. "And the protein paste helps." Silence in the chamber. Then Marath said, "You are telling us that you have tamed this creature with food and repetition." "And trust," Ryland said again. "That part matters. If he didn't trust me, the other stuff wouldn't work." Grex chose this moment to yawn. The yawn was enormous. The jaw opened wide and stayed wide for nearly 3 full seconds, displaying 4 rows of teeth arranged in a pattern that had clearly never been designed with any purpose other than the one nature intended. The subsonic rumble rose for a moment and then settled back down. The amber eyes half closed. Councillor Drethan had to be escorted from the chamber. The session continued. Marath asked most of the questions herself, calmly, methodically, the way she handled everything. How large did Grex get? He was close to his full size now. Had he ever harmed anyone? No, not once had he ever come close. Ryland thought about it. "He got between me and a utility cart that lost its brake and rolled down a slope at me when I was 16. He stopped it, dented his shoulder ridge. He was fine by morning." Marath was quiet for a moment. "He protected you." "He always does," Ryland said. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said everything. After the formal session ended and most of the delegates had filed out, Drethan being assisted by 2 aides, the Thureni delegation moving as a tight group with their heads down, Marath remained at her tier. She sat very still, looking at Grex, who had stretched out on the chamber floor while Rylan reviewed the paperwork for the security review she had formally requested. The creature's eyes were half shut. His ribcage rose and fell in a slow, vast rhythm. Her aide approached and said quietly, "The security review will take 2 days. Shall we hold the cadet and the creature in the habitat ring?" "Yes," Mareth said. Then she said without looking away from Grex, "Does it bite?" Her aide blinked. I can check the documentation." "Not you," she said, "him." Her aide looked at Rylan. Rylan, who had apparently heard, looked up from the paperwork. "Only if I tell him to," he said. Mareth held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at Grex. The creature's tail moved once, slow and heavy, against the polished floor of the Grand Council chamber of Station Ardenmore. The sound it made echoed up 40 meters of transparasteel to where the gas giant hung in the dark outside, enormous and indifferent, and the rings turned the way they always had, knowing nothing and caring less. She could not explain, later, why she did not find the boy's answer frightening. She could not explain, either, why she sat in the empty chamber for another 12 minutes after everyone else had gone, watching Grex breathe. Nobody told Rylan he could not continue the daily walks. This was, in hindsight, an oversight on the part of the station administration. The security review that Mareth had formally requested covered Grex's documentation, his vaccination history, his behavioral records, and the legal validity of the transit permit. It did not cover what Rylan was allowed to do while the review was in progress. And because no one had thought to issue a specific instruction telling him to stay in the habitat ring, Rylan read the absence of that instruction the way 19-year-olds generally read the absence of explicit rules, as permission. So the next morning at 07:00 Standard Time, he clipped the leash to Grex's collar, tucked the tin of protein paste under his arm, and went for a walk. He took the lower decks this time because he had promised Boren he would avoid Corridor 7 while the review was running. The lower decks of Station Ardenmore were a different world from the polished tiers of the council chamber. The ceilings were lower, the lighting was practical rather than pleasant, and the air carried the smell of coolant and engine grease, and the particular combination of food smells that happened when 12 different species were all cooking something in close proximity. The lower decks were where the maintenance crews worked, where the cargo handlers ran their shifts, where the smaller traders and independent contractors who kept the station functioning actually lived. The kind of people who got things done and did not care much for the politics happening 40 meters above their heads. Grex liked it down here. The smells interested him. He moved his wide, flat head from side to side as he walked, amber eyes tracking everything: a rolling cargo cart, a cluster of pipes running along the wall, a Velori maintenance worker who saw him coming and stepped very deliberately into a side corridor and waited there until the footsteps faded. The subsonic rumble was a constant low presence, not aggressive, just there. The way a large engine is always there when you are standing near it. Rylan let him look. There was no harm in looking. They had been on the lower decks for about 20 minutes when the Gurrens appeared. There were 3 of them, standing in the middle of the main lower corridor near the entrance to the cargo exchange. Gurrens were large, nearly 2 meters of chitinous armored body, with wide shoulders, thick limbs, and the kind of angular, hard-edged faces that always looked like they were working up to something unpleasant. These 3 wore contractors' badges, but carried themselves like something else entirely. The leader had a long scar running across the side of his face that had not been treated, which was a choice, not an oversight. They had heard about the human boy. Word traveled fast on the lower decks, especially strange word. A human cadet walking something monstrous on a leash, setting off the council alarm, appearing before all 17 delegates and coming out with his papers stamped. People talked. The Gurrens had listened, decided the story was exaggerated, and positioned themselves in the corridor because dominance displays were the Gunn way of establishing order, and this corridor was currently their territory. The leader crossed his arms when Rellin came around the corner. Rellin saw them, registered that they were blocking the corridor, and slowed his pace to a stroll. He had lived on Dunma Station. He knew what a blocked corridor meant. "Human," the leader said. "The word came out the way some people use a title they do not respect. We heard about your pet." "Most people have at this point," Rellin said. "You think that thing scares anyone down here?" The leader looked at Grex with an expression that was trying to be contempt and landing somewhere slightly short of it. "We have seen worse." Rellin looked at him for a moment. He did not say anything. Grex stopped walking. It was not a dramatic stop. He did not rear up, did not snap, did not make any sudden movement. He simply stopped, putting one foot in front of the other, and went very still. The amber glow in his eyelids shifted not quickly but steadily, the way a color changes when you turn a dial from amber to a deep, pulsing red. The subsonic rumble, which had been low and ambient and almost unnerved, changed frequency. It dropped lower. It became less of a sound and more of a pressure. Something felt in the sternum and behind the eyes, and in the specific, ancient part of the brain that has no language and no logic and only one message. The cargo cart near the far wall rattled. Several loose bolts on a pipe junction above the guns' heads worked free and fell, pinging off the floor one at a time in the sudden quiet. The leader's crossed arms uncrossed. He did not decide to step back. His body stepped back before the decision happened. This is the thing about instinct. It does not consult the part of you that has opinions. The second gun moved left. The third moved right. All three of them moved, and none of them had intended to, and that fact was legible on all three of their faces in the split second before they got their expressions back under control. The leader said nothing. Rellin waited one more beat, then reached into the tin, produced a piece of protein paste, and held it out to Grex. "Come on," he said. "Leave it." Grex took the treat. The red in his eyelids faded back to amber over the course of about 3 seconds. The rumble settled. The bolts on the floor stopped ringing. The cargo cart went still. Rellin walked forward, past the 3 guns, who were each standing very precisely where they were standing and not moving. He did not look at them as he passed. Neither did Grex, who had returned to moving his head from side to side to track the interesting smells in the corridor, tail swinging in its slow, idle arc. At the far end of the corridor, Rellin turned right toward the maintenance ring without glancing back. He did not see the 3 guns stand there in silence for another full minute before one of them, quietly, left. Then the second. Then the leader, who stayed longest, staring at the empty corridor, and then stared at his own hands, which had not trembled in 11 years of contract work in 6 different conflict zones. He did not file a complaint. He did not start any more conversations about the human boy. What he did do over the following week was move his operation to a different section of the lower decks, quietly, without explanation. Security Chief Boren, who had been following Rellin's route at a careful distance for what he had logged as a routine patrol observation, had seen the whole thing from the junction behind a stack of cargo containers. He stood there for a moment after the guns dispersed, looking at the empty corridor, and then at the spot where Grex had stood when the color changed. He pulled up his patrol log and typed a short note. It read, "Creature deterrent effect confirmed. No force used. No order given beyond verbal handler command. Recommend reclassification of Corridor 7L as secondary security patrol route. Assign Cadet DAS Standard Morning Patrol Window, Zara 7, Zara Zara to Zara 7, 35. He paused, then added one more line. Also recommend procurement of protein paste, type unspecified, for handler operational support. He submitted the log, put his hands behind his back, and walked on in the direction Rellin had gone, keeping the same careful distance as before. The lower decks hummed around him, coolant and grease, and the smell of a dozen different kitchens. Somewhere ahead, very faint now, was the low subsonic pulse that meant Grex was walking and calm and paying attention to everything. Boren had been in security work for 23 years. He had escorted dignitaries, broken up riots, managed evacuations, and once talked a Valuri engineer down from a very dangerous misunderstanding involving a plasma line. He had seen a lot of things that worked and a lot of things that did not. He had never seen anything work quite like that. He did not have words for it yet, but the feeling it left, something between respect and something older than respect, stayed with him for the rest of the shift. Dr. Yunoth had a method for understanding things that confused her. She wrote them down. Not in reports, reports were for conclusions. She wrote in a personal log by hand because the act of forming words on paper slowed her thinking down to a speed at which it could actually look at itself. She had been doing this since she was a student, through a postgraduate degree in xenobiology, through 12 years of fieldwork across 9 different star systems, through every strange thing she had encountered in a career full of strange things. The log had 17 volumes. She was well into the 18th. She opened it the morning after the council session and stared at the blank page for a while. Then she wrote, "The creature is called Grex, the human calls it a pet." She stopped, read it back, added, "I do not know what to do with this." She put the log aside and went to the medical bay, because Yunoth was also the station's senior xenobiologic consultant, and the formal security review required a biological assessment of Grex's health, temperament, and risk profile. This was her job. She could do her job. She was good at her job. She had requested that Grex's records be transferred to her workstation, and when she sat down and opened the first file, she braced herself for what she expected to find: escalation reports, incident flags, behavioral warnings. Something to match the size of him, the teeth, the color-shifting eyes, the rumble that had turned her own feathers flat against her arms when she first heard it in the council chamber. The first file was his vaccination record. 14 pages, everything up to date. The veterinary notes were in a human colony dialect that her translator rendered cleanly. Words like "in good condition," "normal weight for age," "coat and scales healthy." She turned to the behavioral assessment. It ran for 6 pages, compiled across Grex's entire life by 3 different veterinary professionals on Dunma Station. She read through it carefully. The words aggressive, dangerous, and incident did not appear once. The words bonded, responsive, handler-directed, and no concerns noted appeared more times than she counted. On the second-to-last page, in a section labeled Additional Notes, the most recent veterinarian had written, "Patient displays mild separation anxiety when handler is absent for extended periods. Recommend continued daily exercise. Prognosis excellent. A very good animal." A very good animal. Yunoth sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she scrolled to the end of the file, where supporting materials had been attached. Medical imagery, growth charts, the kind of documentation that built up over 6 years of regular checkups. And at the very end, filed under miscellaneous, was a photograph. It had been included, she suspected, because someone at the Dunma Veterinary Office had thought it belonged with the record, the way you keep a picture with a file because the file alone does not tell the whole story. The photograph showed a human boy of perhaps 12 or 13, asleep on a couch. The couch was old, clearly a household couch in a private home, with the kind of wear on the armrests that meant it had been used for a long time. The boy was on his side, one arm over the edge. He was slight, not yet grown into the height he would reach later. His face, in sleep, was completely unguarded. Draped across his legs and lower body, heavy and enormous even at a younger age, was Grex. The Ridgeback's head rested on the boy's hip. His eyes were closed. His tail hung off the edge of the couch and lay on the floor. He looked in the photograph like a creature that had found exactly the place it was supposed to be, and had no intention of going anywhere. Yenith looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she closed the file and went to look at something else. In his private office 2 decks up, Counselor Drethin was doing something he had not done in a long time. He was watching security footage. He had requested the recording of the lower deck corridor from the day before, the confrontation that Boren's patrol log had described in careful, neutral language. He watched it once without stopping. Then he watched it again, slowly, pausing at the moment the Gurrens moved backward. Drethin was Muvari. His people had been on the prey end of their ecosystem for longer than their civilization could remember. The Muvari homeworld had produced 14 distinct apex predator species before the Union made first contact, and the Muvari had survived all of them through a combination of intelligence, cooperation, and the specific kind of vigilance that never fully turned off. The wide eyes, the sensitivity to motion. The way every Muvari in a room always knew, without thinking about it, where the exits were. He had spent his adult life in politics, in chambers, in negotiations, in the careful architecture of civilized space. He had not needed the old vigilance in decades. He had thought, perhaps, that it had faded. Then Grex had entered the council chamber, and every ancient thing in Drethin's biology had fired at once, and he had discovered that nothing had faded at all. It had simply been waiting. He watched the footage a third time. He watched Grex go still. He watched the color change in the eyes. He watched the Gurrens, large, armored, dangerous by any reasonable measure, step backward without deciding to, their bodies making the decision before their minds could form an argument. Then he watched Ryland say, "Leave it," and give Grex a piece of protein paste, and walk past the Gurrens as though they were furniture. He sat with that for a long time. What he was thinking about was not Grex. It was his own people. It was what it would have meant on the Muvari homeworld in the early centuries before the Union found them, to have had something like that walking beside them. Not as a weapon, as a presence. Something that stood between his people and the things that hunted them. Something that looked at a predator and made the predator remember what it was like to be small. He did not know what to do with that feeling. It was not fear. It was not admiration. It was something in between those two things, something for which the Muvari language, rich as it was, did not have a precise word. He closed the footage file and sat quietly for a while. On the other side of the station, Boren was in his office, not sitting quietly at all. He had been reading. He had started with Ryland's service file, standard, nothing unusual, colony-raised, solid academic scores, unremarkable physical assessments. Then he had pulled the transit documentation for Grex, which confirmed everything Ryland had said in the council chamber and nothing he had not. And then, because Boren was thorough in a way that sometimes led him down long corridors of information he had not planned to walk down, he had started reading about humans. Not about their military capacity, or their political history with the Union, or their territorial boundaries. He had started reading about domestication. The human practice, tens of thousands of years old, of taking wild animals and making them into something else. He had not known before this morning that the process went back that far. He had assumed it was a recent development, the kind of thing a space-faring civilization might do with gene-editing tools and controlled environments. He had been wrong. They had done it with time, with patience, with food and repetition and the specific, stubborn human insistence on staying near something dangerous long enough that it stopped being afraid of them. And this was the part that sat strangely in his chest, long enough that they stopped being afraid of it. He read about dogs. He read about horses. He read about a bird called a falcon that humans had learned to fly against prey, and then carry on their wrists like jewelry, and then, eventually, simply keep because they wanted to. He read about elephants, which were large enough to kill a human without effort, and which some humans had trained to work alongside them for centuries. He read a record of a human who kept a large constrictor snake as a companion for 19 years, and at whose burial the snake was reported to have refused food for a month. He stared at the ceiling of his office. He was not afraid of Grex anymore. That was the thing he noticed when he checked. The fear that had fired in his chest when the Ridgeback first came around the corner in Corridor 7, large, warm-blooded in its heat signature, moving with the particular fluid weight of something that had no natural predators. That fear was still there somewhere, the way a bruise stays after the pain fades. But it was no longer in charge. What was in charge was something that felt like curiosity, and underneath the curiosity something quieter, something like respect. He filed Boren's patrol log, closed the reading files, and went to find out what time Ryland's walk was scheduled for the next morning. He wanted to be in the right corridor. It started the way rumors always start on a space station, quietly, between people who had nothing to gain from telling anyone, which meant they told everyone. The Gurren contractors had moved their operation to a different corridor. This was known. The reason was not officially stated, but the lower decks had eyes everywhere, and everyone who had been in the maintenance ring that morning had seen what they had seen. By the following day, the vendors along Corridor 7L, who had been paying the Gurrens in goods and credit for 3 months to be left alone, opened their stalls without making the usual transfer. One of them, a Drenkai parts dealer named Asev who had been in business on the lower decks for 11 years, left a small bundle of dried grain stalks at the entrance to the corridor. A traditional Drenkai gesture, something like gratitude offered to a thing you could not speak to directly. 2 other vendors followed suit over the next 2 days. None of them could have explained clearly who the offering was for. It was not for Rylan. He was a cadet. Cadets did not receive offerings. The bundle was left low, near the floor, near the wall, in a spot roughly at the height of a large flat head if that head were carried low and steady and moving at a calm walking pace. Rylan did not notice the bundles. Grex noticed them. He swung his head to sniff each one as he passed, approved of the smell and moved on. It was on the 4th day after the council session that Dr. Yenith fell into step beside Rylan at the junction of the habitat ring and the lower corridor approach. She had prepared a justification. She had written it in her personal log. She was continuing her behavioral assessment for the security review, observing the creature in its normal ambulatory context, close-range observation being more informative than any records or footage. This was all true. She had her observation tablet with her. She had a stylus clipped to her coat. She did not use either of them. She walked beside Rylan and Grex for the first 5 minutes in complete silence, watching Grex move and watching the corridor react to him. Vendors stepping back. A pair of Velori workers pausing their conversation mid-sentence and staying paused until the rumble faded. A Thureni engineer who turned a corner, saw what was coming, and took 3 sharp steps backward before catching himself and going very still against the wall. "Does it bother you," she asked eventually, "the way they react?" Rylan thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "not because I think he's going to do anything, just because," he paused, looking for the right words. "He can't explain himself. He just is what he is, and they see what he is and they can't get past it, and there's nothing I can do about that part." Yenith wrote nothing. She was thinking about the photograph in the file, the sleeping boy, the weight of Grex on his legs, enormous even then. "How old were you," she said, "when you stopped being afraid of him?" Rylan glanced at her. "Honestly, I don't really remember being afraid of him. I was about 4 when we first got him. He was small. He fit on my lap," he considered. "By the time he was too big to fit on my lap, I already knew him." They walked in quiet for another stretch. Grex's tail swung. His icelets tracked a cargo drone moving along the upper track and then lost interest. "What was it like?" Yenith said. "Growing up with something like him?" It was a different kind of question, and Rylan seemed to hear that. He walked a few paces before answering. "Safe," he said. "I always felt safe. When you are a kid and you are small and the world is large and you do not always understand it," he stopped briefly. "He always knew if something was wrong before I did. He would go still, or he would put himself between me and something. Every time." He looked at Grex, who was moving his head to sniff at the bundle of grain stalks near the base of the wall. "I don't know. It is hard to explain if you didn't grow up with it." Yenith thought she was beginning to understand it regardless. They turned a corner onto the wide central lower promenade, which was as close to a public street as the lower decks got, a broad corridor with stalls on both sides, lighting warmer than the maintenance sections, foot traffic from a dozen species running their daily business. Rylan made this part of the route every day. The promenade vendors had already seen him and Grex twice and had graduated from panic to cautious observation, which, on a space station, counted as familiarity. They were halfway down the promenade when the child appeared. She was Velori, small, young, her body in its natural unguarded state, the camouflage patterns that adult Velori used as emotional regulation not yet fully developed in her. Young Velori were translucent, shifting slowly between pale blues and greens, lit from within by the bioluminescent cells that would deepen into richer color as they aged. She had been standing behind her parent, a full-grown Velori adult who was camouflage cycling rapidly through the mottled browns that indicated high anxiety. The parent had a firm hold on the child's arm. The child was not anxious. She was staring at Grex with the absolute focused attention of a young creature that has not yet been fully taught what to be afraid of. Then the parent's grip slipped for 1 second, distracted, shifting weight, turning to say something to a vendor, and the child walked forward. 2 meters. She closed the distance to 2 meters from Grex in 4 quick steps and stopped, looking up at him. She was barely taller than his knee. The promenade went quiet. Not the panicked quiet of Corridor 7 on the first morning, a different quiet. Held breath. Everyone who had eyes was using them. Grex stopped walking. He looked down at the child. She looked up at him. The amber glow of his eyes cast a faint warm light on her translucent face, and her own bioluminescence, unpracticed and uncontrolled, flickered through 3 quick colors in a row: surprise, curiosity, something that in a Velori child reads very close to delight. Grex lowered his head. He did it slowly, the way he did everything when he was calm, no sudden movement, no drama, just a steady, deliberate drop of that enormous armored skull toward the floor until his head was level with the child. The spinal ridges along his back lay flat. The subsonic rumble, which had been at its usual walking frequency, shifted lower and slower until it was barely a vibration at all. Something rhythmic, something almost like a sound that had no name. The child reached out and put her hand on his snout. Grex stayed perfectly still. His eyelets did not change color. His tail did not move. He held the position with the patience of an animal that understood, on some level it had no language for, that something small and unafraid had just offered it something, and that the right response was to not move. The parent found the child approximately 4 seconds later. The adult Velori's camouflage went through every color it knew in rapid succession, which in their species is the equivalent of a scream, but a silent one, internal and contained. They took hold of the child firmly and drew her back, speaking in the rapid clicking low-tone register that meant urgency in Velori. The child, being taken away, looked back at Grex. She made a sound. Young Velori make a sound when they are happy that adult Velori stop making sometime in early adolescence. A short, high, repeated tone that has no specific translation but means something close to wonderful. Grex watched her go. Then he looked back at Rylan, who was watching him, tin of protein paste already open. "Yeah," Rylan said quietly, "I saw that." He held out a piece. "Good boy." Grex took it from his hand, careful as he always was, and they walked on. That evening, in the Grand Council chamber, Marath reviewed the footage. Her aide had flagged it as relevant to the security review and forwarded it without comment, which Yenith had suggested, which was why Yenith was a good researcher. She understood that some evidence worked better if it arrived without explanation. Marath watched the footage twice. Then she turned off the screen and sat with the chamber dark around her, the gas giant visible through the transparisteel above, its rings moving in their slow and ancient circle. Her aide delivered Boren's formal security assessment on a data pad. She read it standing up, which was not her habit, because sitting felt wrong for the moment. The assessment recommended full reclassification of Grex from biohazard to registered companion animal. It cited the behavioral record, the documentation, the handler's license, and 2 days of direct observational data. It was thorough and careful and professionally written, and it said, in the clear language of a security professional who chose his words deliberately, that there was no threat here that had not already been contained by a 19-year-old human with a tin of protein paste. Marath signed it. Then she picked up a stylus, actual stylus, not the digital kind, and added a note to the physical copy. She wrote it at the bottom of the last page in her own hand, in Selori script, which translated roughly as, "What does it mean that they made something like this gentle? And what else have they made gentle that we do not yet know about?" She did not include the note in the official record. She kept it, filed it in the private section of her correspondence, where she kept the things that were not yet conclusions but were too important to lose. 2 weeks after the klaxon, the daily walk appeared on the official station calendar. It was listed under the heading Security Patrol, Lower Ring and Promenade Circuit, assigned to Cadet R. Das, time window 07:00 to 07:40 standard, recurring daily. Boren had submitted the scheduling request through the proper channels with the appropriate justifications and the appropriate forms, and the station administration had approved it because it was presented correctly, and nobody wanted to be the person who rejected it and then had to explain why. Nobody on the lower decks needed the calendar. They already knew. The vendors along corridor 7L had started opening their stalls at 06:50 so they would be settled before the walk came through. The bundle of dried grain stalks was replaced at the corridor entrance every other day by Asev, the parts dealer, who had never spoken to Rylan directly, but had started leaving twice the usual amount of stock on his front display table, as though the steady absence of Gurin contractors had made him feel, cautiously, like he had room to grow. 3 xenobiological research teams had submitted formal requests to study the Rylan-Grex behavioral dynamic for publication in Union academic journals. Dr. Yeneth had not submitted one. She was still writing in her personal log. She was into the 3rd new section of Volume 18 and was not close to any conclusions, which she felt was appropriate, because some things needed more time than others. Counselor Drethan had returned to his regular duties and had said nothing publicly about what he had seen in the lower corridor footage. But he had requested, quietly, a detailed briefing from the Union Cultural Archive on human domestication history, and had spent 2 evenings reading it. His aide reported that the counselor had been in an unusually thoughtful mood for the past week, and had stopped flinching during the opening gong of council sessions, which was not connected, but was noticeable. And Marath had, without explanation, blocked out a 40-minute window in her schedule on a Tuesday morning and listed the purpose, in the calendar system that her aide managed, and that no one else had access to, as personal. Rylan was at the junction of the habitat ring, and the lower corridor approach at 07:02 when she appeared. She was not wearing her council robes. She was wearing the plain silver-gray coat that Selori used as everyday dress, the kind without insignia or rank markings. Her feathers were neat but not formally arranged. She had no aide with her, which was the thing Rylan noticed first. Because Marath had never been without an aide in any of the interactions he had observed since arriving on the station. She looked like a person who had decided to do something, and had decided, also, not to make it into anything larger than it was. Rylan gave her a small nod. He did not say anything, partly because he was not sure of the right thing to say, and partly because he had spent enough time with Grex to know that some arrivals did not need to be announced. She fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a while. Grex moved at his usual pace between them and slightly ahead, head swinging, tail in its slow arc, the subsonic rumble a low constant that Marath had stopped noticing sometime around the 5th day of the security review, which she had realized only when she noticed she was no longer aware of it. The corridor opened up into the promenade. Vendors looked up. A few of them recognized Marath immediately, which was the thing about being a council speaker. Your face was on official union documents across 17 species home systems. 2 of them straightened. One of them, a young Drenkai stall worker, started to raise her hand in the formal greeting gesture and then caught herself, because Marath was not in robes and the morning was clearly not for formal gestures. Grex paused at Asiv's stall. Asiv was arranging parts on his front table and froze when the shadow fell across him. Then he looked down, and the wide flat head was level with his table, amber eyes regarding him from a distance of about 30 centimeters. Grex sniffed at the table edge, approved of something, and moved on. Asiv let out a breath and went back to arranging his parts, and the Drenkai stall worker nearby observed that Asiv was smiling, which was not something she had seen him do in the 3 months she had worked beside him. They turned onto the wider arc of the promenade and walked. Marath spoke first. "When your species first applied for union membership," she said, her voice conversational, unhurried, "the preliminary assessment described humans as manageable. The analyst wrote that you were unlikely to cause large-scale disruption, that you were a mid-tier civilization in most measurable categories." She paused. "It was considered a fair assessment at the time." Rylan glanced at her. "Sounds about right," he said. She looked at Grex, who had turned his head to watch a cargo drone traveling the upper track, amber eyes following it with mild interest. "The analyst had clearly never met one of you," she said. Rylan considered this. He did not respond immediately, the way he rarely responded to anything immediately, not from slowness, but from the habit of actually thinking first. "I think the analyst was probably right about the categories," he said eventually. "We're not the biggest, not the fastest. We don't have the best ships or the longest history." He watched Grex lose interest in the drone and return his attention to the promenade. He stopped and tried again. "We tend to stay close to things, even when the things are difficult, even when the things are large," he shrugged. "We are stubborn about that part." Marath was quiet for a few paces. "Stubborn," she said. "It's the kindest word for it," Rylan said. She looked at him. There was something in his face that was hard to read, not cleverness exactly, not confidence exactly, something in between those two things that did not have a clean name in Selori language. She had been in politics for 30 years, and she had learned to read faces the way other people read text. She read his face now, and what she found was simply someone telling her the truth, plainly, without any decoration, because the truth seemed to him the easiest and most natural thing to say. Grex had stopped. He was standing at the place where, 4 days ago, the Velori child had touched his snout. He stood there for a moment, sniffing the air, reading whatever information the floor and the walls carried in their residual warmth and scent. Then he looked up and around, and seemed to decide that whatever he was looking for was not there today, and walked on. Rylan watched this, and his expression did something brief and private that Marath caught and could not quite classify. Not sadness, closer to fondness, the look of someone watching a thing they know well do something familiar. They had nearly completed the full circuit of the promenade when Marath said, "I keep returning to a question I cannot answer." "What's that?" Rylan said. She thought about how to say it. "Your people took something like him," she gestured once precisely at Grex's broad armored back, "and made it into this, made it follow a leash, made it take food from a child's hand." She stopped there for a moment. "And what I cannot determine is whether that speaks to something extraordinary about humans or something extraordinary about the creature." Rylan thought about this longer than he thought about most things. He walked another 20 meters of corridor, and Grex walked beside him, and the rumble moved through the floor at its low, constant frequency, and the vendors watched from their stalls, and the gas giant turned outside the station's hull in the dark. "Both maybe," he said finally. "He trusted me because I gave him reasons to, and I trusted him because he gave me reasons to. Neither of us started with the trust. We built it." He looked at her. "I don't think that's unique to humans. I think it just takes a long time and you have to be willing to stay close to something that could hurt you. Most people aren't." Marath said nothing. They reached the end of the promenade. Ryland stopped, opened the tin of protein paste and produced the last piece, which he held out flat on his palm. Grex took it without using his teeth. He always did. He had done this in one form or another every day of his life since Ryland was 4 years old. Ryland closed the tin. He looked at Marath. He held the tin out to her. She looked at it. She looked at Grex, who had turned his head toward her because she was new and the new ones sometimes had food. The amber eyes regarded her steadily. The rumble continued at its calm frequency. He was enormous. His shoulder was at her chest height. His jaw, closed, was the length of her arm. Every ancient thing in every living species on 17 planets that had ever learned what a large predator meant would have. And did look at Grex and feel the old clear message going off like a bell in the body. She reached into the tin. She took a piece. She held it out the way Ryland held it, flat palm, fingers together. She had watched him do it enough times in the footage that she knew the shape of the gesture. Grex leaned forward. His head dipped. His mouth opened just enough, careful, deliberate, the jaw moving in the small, precise way it always moved when Ryland offered a piece, and he took the food from her hand. No scratch, no pressure, nothing. He straightened, chewed once, and then turned away and sat down beside Ryland with the settled air of a creature that had finished its walk and was prepared to wait for whatever came next. Marath looked at her hand. Then she looked at Grex. Then she looked at Ryland, who was watching her with the same expression she had been trying to read all morning, plain, open, honest, slightly puzzled by all the fuss. She handed the tin back to him. She straightened her coat. She said nothing, because the right words had not arrived yet, and she was not the kind of person who filled silence with the wrong ones. She gave him a small nod, the kind she gave people when a meeting had ended well, and walked back in the direction of the habitat ring. Somewhere in the station's automated security log, a note generated itself at 07:38 Standard Time. Patrol circuit complete. No incidents reported. Boren read it in his office over his second cup of whatever the Drenkai called a morning drink, which was strong and brown and did not taste like anything else. He had been reading it every morning, the same clean line, since Ryland's route went onto the official calendar. He had also been reading, in his private time, more of the human historical record. He had gotten to the section about working dogs, the ones bred across centuries to guard, to herd, to find lost people in the dark. He had read about the dogs trained to detect illness in their owners before the owners knew it themselves. He had read about dogs that sat at the graves of people they had loved and would not leave. He put his cup down. He thought about Grex lying across a sleeping boy's legs in an old photograph. He thought about Grex stopping a runaway cart when Ryland was 16 and being fined by morning. He thought about the way Grex had held perfectly still while a Velori child touched his face, and the way his eyelets had stayed amber the entire time. He opened a new document in his personal log, not the official record, the private one, and wrote a single line. There is something about humans I did not understand before this week. I am not sure I understand it now, but I think it has something to do with the fact that they have never learned to give up on the things they love, even when those things are difficult and large and could, by any reasonable measure, destroy them. He stopped, read it back, added, "They are very stubborn about that part." He saved it, closed the log, finished his drink. In Corridor 7, the morning light, the artificial kind that the station cycled to match a standard planetary day, warm and low in the early hours, fell across the clean floor and the bundles of grain stalks at the wall, and the faint impressions that six-legged footsteps had made over 2 weeks in the dust near the edge of the promenade, where the cleaning drones did not quite reach. The klaxon was silent. It had been silent for 14 days. The station breathed in its ordinary rhythms, the low hum of the ventilation, the distant clang of the cargo lifts, the thousand small sounds of thousands of lives being lived in the usual way. In the security log, the entry read, "No incidents." For the first time since the alarm, it was entirely, completely true.